For thousands of years, India and China have been connected by two trade networks, the Overland Silk Road and the lesser-known Maritime Silk Road. Today, our focus is going to be on the Maritime Silk Road. The Maritime Silk Road serves as powerful evidence that historical Asia was deeply interconnected. But the Maritime Silk Road wasn't just a trade network. It was also used by missionizing Buddhist monks and Hindu Brahmins, by diplomats and adventurers. Simply put, the routes were a part of a vast intracontinental exchange: trade, piracy, diplomacy, raids, and cultural expansion. Perhaps unsurprisingly given their location, Indian ports served as the vital heart of this network, linking together the Asian continent from end to end. Let's dive into the eastern section of the Maritime Silk Road, the trade routes connecting India, Southeast Asia, and China. The Maritime Silk Road existed as early as the 2nd century BCE, but in the early days, trade infrastructure was relatively undeveloped. It was not until the 4th century CE, nearly 600 years later, that we begin to see the systemic, large-scale exchange of goods, ideas, and peoples. The dynamics of supply and demand remained relatively constant throughout much of the Maritime Silk Road's history. Foreign merchants were frothing at the mouth to get a piece of China's enormous consumer market pie, and to obtain quality manufactured goods. After all, China was prosperous and highly populated. China would export a variety of items that were prized abroad, silk and ceramics especially, but also copper, jade, and silver. Meanwhile, it would import large quantities of sandalwood, black pepper, and spices from India and Southeast Asia. As for manufactured goods, the Chinese would routinely import glass from Europe, tin from Southeast Asia, and textiles from India. Despite China's central importance in the Maritime Silk Road trade, for most of its history, their native merchants were not directly involved in the shipping industry. Instead, the routes were mostly plied by Indian, Middle Eastern, and Southeast Asian merchant sailors. From India, trade was conducted throughout its coasts, primarily in the southern regions, the Konkan, Malabar, and Coromandel coasts, but also on the Utkal coast, along the areas known as Kalinga and Bengal. Interestingly, the colloquial term for Indian in Southeast Asia is Keling, which is a bastardization of the region of Kalinga. In any case, trade flourished, but ships weren't just carrying goods, they were also carrying people full of ideas and ready to proselytize. Southeast Asia served as a key passage for goods going from India and further west towards China. It's no surprise then that they would be exposed to ideas emanating from the Indian subcontinent. From at least the 3rd or 4th centuries CE, Southeast Asian polities became increasingly Indianized, linguistically, politically, and religiously. Indian socio-political norms were imitated, and Hindu and Buddhist thought came to dominate. Many popular myths, dance forms, and musical styles were wholesale imported from India. Who brought these cultural norms from India to Southeast Asia? And why didn't Southeast Asian polities take on Chinese culture and modes of thought instead? There are a number of theories. What we do know is that Indian merchants, many belonging to powerful South Indian merchant guilds, had established vibrant, influential communities throughout Southeast Asia, from coastal Thailand to Java. For example, an 8th century Tamil inscription in southern Thailand describes water tanks built by the merchant guild Manigramam for the benefit of their guild members and for residents of a nearby military camp. The inscription further notes that the construction was requested by the Tamil Pallava king Nandivarman III. Side note, speaking of the Pallava dynasty, their linguistic script was exported to Southeast Asia in the 5th and 6th centuries and formed the basis for many Southeast Asian scripts, including Thai. It's unlikely that the merchant class is solely responsible for transmitting Indian culture to Southeast Asia. Modern historians tend to believe that some combination of Hindu priests, scholars, and merchants all played a role. Many elements of Indianization appear to have been taken up in a top-down fashion and are indicative of Brahmanical influence. The imposition of the caste system, the spread of Hindu religious and philosophical traditions among local elites, the influence of Hindu architecture, and the establishment of Hindu codes of law all point to the importance of Brahmins in Indianizing Southeast Asia. But why didn't Southeast Asian kingdoms pick up Chinese modalities instead? China's systemic aggressions gave Southeast Asian kingdoms pause. China routinely invaded northern Vietnam, Korea, and its other neighbors. Apprehension about Chinese expansion led the rulers of Southeast Asia to prefer Indian political and religious iconography. Choosing to take on Indian norms was safe. After all, until the medieval Cholas, no Indian empire had attempted to invade or interfere with the autonomy of Southeast Asian kingdoms. It's also worth noting that China was more insular in its worldview. At times, it even prohibited Chinese merchants from engaging in trade abroad. These prohibitions prevented large-scale cultural exportation to Southeast Asia. By contrast, Indian merchants who plied the trade and established themselves in Southeast Asian cities readily exported their culture to Southeast Asia. They intermarried with natives and involved themselves in local affairs. But India's cultural reach was not limited to Southeast Asia. In the religious context, it even exerted a level of cultural hegemony over East Asia, especially China. There's some controversy as to how Buddhism first arrived in China. Some historians believe that Buddhism first arrived in China through the overland Silk Road in 68 CE. Some modern historians believe that Buddhism actually made its way to southern China via the Maritime Silk Road in 65 CE. In any case, Buddhist thought was rapidly integrated into Chinese society, and the Indian subcontinent remained a place of significant interest for Chinese monks and scholars for nearly 1,000 years. Buddhist monks with a particular sense of adventure, academic curiosity, and wanderlust departed from both sides of this exchange, India and China, to explore places foreign to them. They taught, journaled, and translated books. Not all monks made use of the maritime route exclusively. The Chinese monk Fa Xian, for example, entered North India through the overland Silk Road in the 5th century CE, but left for his return trip to China through Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Other monks made extensive use of the resources available along the Maritime Silk Road. Consider the Chinese monk Yi Jing, who lived in the 7th century. Yi Jing was a lifelong admirer of Fa Xian and, inspired, decided to travel all the way to India himself. Thanks to a gift from an unknown benefactor, Yi Jing was able to depart for India through Southeast Asia. He stopped in Palembang, the capital of the Srivijaya Empire and a centerpiece of Maritime Silk Road trade. He spent 6 months there, studying Sanskrit and Malay. From Palembang, Yi Jing departed for India and lived and studied in Nalanda University for 11 years, collecting a number of Buddhist treatises and artifacts. He then returned to Palembang, where he stayed for nearly a decade. During this time, he was helped by foreign monks in translating the texts that he had obtained in India. He left only briefly for southern China to resupply on inks and paper. Of Palembang, Yi Jing wrote, "In the city, Buddhist priests number more than 1,000. They investigate and study all the subjects that exist, just as in India. The rules and ceremonies are not at all different. If a Chinese priest wishes to go to the West in order to hear and read the original scriptures, he had better stay here 1 or 2 years and practice the proper rules." Indian Buddhist monks also made fascinating journeys to China and the rest of East Asia. Bodhidharma, a Tamil monk from the 5th century CE, who traveled to China and founded Zen Buddhism. According to legend, he may have also contributed to Shaolin Kung Fu. Bodhisena, a Tamil monk from the 8th century CE, who traveled to China and Japan. He taught Sanskrit and helped to ensure that Buddhism would maintain a foothold in Japan, despite the objections of Shinto conservatives. Subhakara Sinha, an Odia monk from the 8th century CE, who traveled to China and became politically influential, favored by the Tang Emperor. Vajrabodhi, a Tamil monk from the 8th century CE who traveled to China via Palembang. In China, he became the head of the Jianfu Temple in the capital of Chang'an. He was a politically influential monk who had ties to the imperial court and enjoyed the patronage of nobility. Amoghavajra, a half-Indian monk from the 8th century CE who was the disciple of Vajrabodhi. He would later become one of the most politically powerful monks in the history of China, obtaining a military governorship and having a massive influence on Chinese politics and culture. He made significant headway in temple projects designed to promote Indian iconography in China, and performed rites at the request of the Tang Emperor to avert natural and military disasters. Indian monks became so politically powerful in China that the Tang government reacted and briefly expelled all foreign monks in the mid-8th century. And all this is just scratching the surface. Commerce, politics, and cultural exchange along the Maritime Silk Road was subject to many influences. By the medieval era, the Maritime Silk Road kingdoms were truly globalized. For example, socio-political upheaval in India and China had ramifications for Southeast Asia. From the late 8th century to the early 10th century, the political situation in India and China had serious impacts on Maritime Silk Road trade. In India, 3 major events are worth noting: Islamic invasion, the tripartite struggle over North India, and the disintegration of Pallava rule in South India. In China, the Tang dynasty had become increasingly weak. It had lost several battles against expanding Central Asian powers and was embroiled in a string of domestic uprisings. Tang China reacted to political turmoil by turning inwards, becoming xenophobic and making it difficult for foreign merchants to gain access to Chinese markets. The Tang government officially severed many trade links, causing a substantial decline in commerce. Indian and Chinese trade disruptions were felt deeply. Southeast Asian powers relied on the Maritime Silk Road trade. Its disturbance led to fundamental changes. The Srivijaya Empire unraveled as local feudal lords began to compete with one another over the declining trade. As Srivijaya lost control over key ports in the straits, pirates were able to operate more freely. During this era, pirates posed such a threat to sea commerce that goods were being transported overland across the Isthmus of Kra in a bid to avoid piracy. But change was on the horizon. By the late 10th century CE, trade was booming along the Maritime Silk Road once again. In fact, the routes were better trafficked and commerce was freer than it had ever been in the past. What changed? In India, the Tamil Chola Empire consolidated its rule over much of South India. Meanwhile, the trade-friendly Fatimid dynasty established itself in Egypt, and the trade-friendly Song dynasty took over southern China and its ports. The Song dynasty's rule was a period of great commercial and industrial growth in China. The changes that occurred during this period have been referred to as the medieval economic revolution. Population in the southern provinces of China exploded. The period also saw expanded money supply, the creation of bills of exchange, new forms of credit and paper money, and the adoption of foreigner-friendly trade policies. Simply put, the Song dynasty made China into a golden goose. To coordinate overseas trade and taxation, the Song dynasty established maritime trade supervisораtes. They also moved away from ritualized tribute missions and towards private trade enterprise. This trade was often carried out by international merchant communities, who set themselves up locally in Chinese ports. In Quanzhou, for example, archaeologists have discovered the structure of a Tamil temple, indicative of the Indian community that lived in the city and were involved in trade. The large profits made by Song China are attested to in the historical record. The Song dynasty benefited so greatly from expanding trade that they developed many new ports along the coast to accommodate the volume of commerce. During the medieval era, the Maritime Silk Road also became a much preferable route to the Overland Silk Road. In the 1020s CE, the Overland Silk Road had become too dangerous to traverse. The Song dynasty officially warned diplomats and merchants against using said routes, and encouraged people to use the maritime routes instead. By the 1400s CE, the expansion of the maritime trade led to a more active foreign policy towards Indian powers. Chinese merchants were now actively involved in trade throughout Southeast Asia and India. In fact, Chinese merchants established seasonal communities throughout South India. Court officials, merchants, and ships from China made recurrent trips to the coastal regions of India and contributed to the surge in maritime commerce. For example, in the 14th century, the Yuan dynasty sent officials to South India to convince small maritime kingdoms, such as Kollam and the Madurai Sultanate, to submit to Yuan overlordship. These exchanges laid the foundations for the selection of the Indian coast as a primary destination for the expeditions of Ming Admiral Zheng He. Admiral Zheng He's fleet served the Ming dynasty's political and economic ambitions. The primary goal of Zheng He's voyages was to exact tribute and to promote the flow of international goods to markets in China. The Ming were disinterested in military expeditions or direct colonialism in India. Instead, they sought to extend their influence through diplomacy and soft power. The nature and impact of this diplomacy can be highlighted through Ming interference in Kerala politics. Calicut and Cochin were two rival kingdoms and were on the brink of war in the early 15th century. In order to prevent a military confrontation, the Ming court granted special status to Cochin and its ruler. This was a smart bet. Cochin soon emerged as the more important seaport on the Malabar coast, and the Chinese now enjoyed a heightened privilege. It was also during this time that Chinese merchants began to frequent ports along the Coromandel coast and the Bay of Bengal. The historical relationship between India, China, and Southeast Asia is deeply intertwined with the Maritime Silk Road. The shifting dynamics of commerce, culture, and politics gives us insight into the highly globalized world of medieval Asia. And now you know.